Hello, my name is Douglas Scott McCarron. It is day 511 of Vlad the Murderer's 3 to 7 day war in Ukraine. I've been following this stupidity since about a week before February 24th, 2022. I support Ukraine. Why? Among my Ukrainian friends, I count 4 grandparents, 7 parents, and over 10 children dead. I have not commented before, but I heard something a few weeks back that struck me as odd about the slowness of the Ukrainian offensive. That being the main point, that it is going slow. Many people think it should be going faster. I heard many TV reporters state that it is nothing like the Americans storming ashore in Normandy and sweeping through France, which told me these reporters don't know a lot about that invasion and the struggle involved before the Allied breakout that swept across France. So if you will indulge me, I would like to talk about that struggle, the current Ukrainian offensive, and is it really slow? And it might be an advantage to go slow. On the screen you can see a relief map of Ukraine. There are lots of rivers and what look like rugged terrain. It is at such a large scale this ruggedness is somewhat deceiving. Most videos of Ukraine show wide open flat fields with tree lines along roadways and separating different farms. They don't look rugged. And that is the first thing I would like to point out: the size of Ukraine and its borders with Russia and Belarus. Looking at Wikipedia, the repository of fact and fiction, I looked up the length of the borders along Holland, Belgium, and France that the Germans attacked in 1940. Wikipedia said the border was 630 kilometers, or 390 miles. Germany attacked with 3,350,000 troops. That is about 8,590 troops per mile. In 1941, during the invasion of the Soviet Union by the Axis powers, known as Barbarossa, the length of the western border, excluding Finland, was 1,600 kilometers, or 990 miles. The estimated troops on the Axis side was 3,700,000, or about 3,737 troops per mile. Ukraine's border with Belarus is approximately 1,084 kilometers, or 674 miles. The border with Russia, as you can see, is disputed, but the agreed international border is 1,974 kilometers, or 1,226 miles. That means Ukraine's border with the other two is 1,900 miles, much longer than the length of the Barbarossa campaign's borders. But the current day's armies are counted in the few hundred thousands, which explains a lot of what is happening. But I will come back to that in a later video. Okay, this is a map of the Normandy landings area and the expansion from there, known to many as D-Day. This is the invasion referred to by those reporters that got me to start making videos. Before I get into this, I suggest you look at the site World War II Every Day with Army Sizes on YouTube, so you can see how things change daily. I also suggest you look at Jake Bro on YouTube, where he has a video using a section of this showing how slow it took to expand in Normandy. It took a couple months to take that little area. But I want to go into a little bit more detail of the Normandy fight, and then look at the fight in Ukraine. Okay, back to the Normandy map. On this map, there are 2 time frames. One is from the landing on June 6, 1944, up to the date of June 13th, or 8 days. The second part is from the 14th to the 30th, or 17 days. Keep in mind the Allies had absolute domination of the skies, a naval fleet with very heavy firepower, lots of artillery, and once the beach was penetrated, no intense fortified zones to pass through, though the bocage with open fields and sunken roads were a problem. At this point, the Allied goal was to capture the deep sea port of Cherbourg, and as you can see, the U.S. advanced on it over the course of a week. But take a look at the scale in the upper right of the map. You can see the advance was about 15 miles in a week. And on the right side of the map, where the UK and Canadian troops were, They moved between a mile and 5 miles in 17 days. Why the difference? Partially, it was the objectives. For the Allies, they needed a deep water port to support the push across France. For the Germans, it was more important to defend against a breakout near Caen. There was somewhat open terrain to Paris, if that happened, and as you can see, a road network leading out of Caen. So, the two sides had different goals. The U.S. placed the 82nd and 101st Airborne and 90th Infantry Divisions in a blocking deployment, while the 4th, 9th, and 79th Infantry headed to Cherbourg. Looking at the Canadian and UK zone and the units they were against, 2nd, 21st, and Panzer Lehr, plus 1st, 2nd, 9th, and 12th SS, 7 tank divisions on much more open ground. Well, you can get the idea of why the Canadians and UK troops didn't move forward much in this phase. In Ukraine, you have a different situation. Both sides fought a long battle for a village of no importance, except it allowed Ukraine to form units with Western equipment and training, and the Russians to build a lot of interlocking fortifications. Kind of a classic tech versus trench fight. War often comes to that. This is more like the Battle of Kursk, where the Germans attacked with their best tanks against strong Soviet defenses, and a lot of Soviet equipment and troops. I say this because while in Normandy it was rough for the Allies, there weren't built-up belts of fortifications like Ukraine is moving into. And as of today, I am hearing they have pushed through the screen and are now among the frontline strongpoints. And to restate, the U.S. was averaging 2 miles a day, while the UK and Canadians were less than half a mile a day, with air dominance, naval gunfire, overwhelming supplies, and no fortified belt. So to my ears, the Ukrainian military is doing rather well. For those of you who haven't studied the Normandy campaign, a few weeks later, after Allies and Axis got a lot of dead people, the Allies eventually ground their way to a point where they broke out, swung around, and trapped an entire German army. For example, if I lose 5 tanks a day, and you lose 2, but I can replace mine daily and you can't, eventually you won't have any tanks. And then I can run over you. So by wearing down the Germans, day after day, wrecking their supplies, their morale, eventually the German line caved in, and I believe that is what is happening now. There is one difference that sticks out to me between Normandy and the current battle. The usual statement is you need 3-to-1 odds to attack and will lose at least 2-to-1. But I'm hearing the Ukrainians are attacking with fewer troops than the Russians and losing 1 for every 8 Russian. I have no way of verifying any of this, but if that is even close, that's pretty amazing. I think from a military point of view, Ukraine is doing better than the Allies in Normandy. Now, as for complaining about the slowness of the offensive, I think this is because many people play games or watch movies. But the point is not to take territory, it is to defeat the other side. And there are problems with ripping the front and pressing forward. For instance, you are extending away from your supply source and compressing on the opponent's supplies. Thus, they will have more ammo, you will have less. So you want a steady advance instead of racing forward, unless you know it is a for certain thing. Another thing about advancing slowly, especially against a fortified area, is you can find where the enemy is and attack them. A lot of people, in talking about World War II, speak with reverence of the Nazi advancements in France and the Soviet Union. They seem not to notice that after the encirclements, the Germans had to stop and regroup and clean out what they had encircled, which means all your forward thrust has to stop, or your front forces can run out of fuel and ammo, especially if you have encircled a fortified zone with lots of ammo and food. Many people nowadays talk about how stupid the Russians are, but to point it out, the Ukrainians reminded us the Russians are not stupid, because they are not. The stupid people may be us. One other thing to keep in mind about the reverence of the Nazi encirclements and lightning warfare. They lost the war. An observation about the racing forward and pausing during Barbarossa. The distance from Brest to Moscow is 619 miles. From June 22, 1941 to the Soviet counteroffensive in December is 167 days, or an average of 3.7 miles a day. So this massive panzer thrusting, swirling offense, on average, wasn't that much more than the Americans slogging their way to Cherbourg. But the Germans did have to try to move fast due to a lack of ability to win in a drawn-out economic war. They simply didn't have the production, and especially they didn't have oil to drive all this new equipment. Speed doesn't win war, production does. The Russians tried to do a lightning strike. It actually was a pretty good plan, but it depended totally on taking the airfield outside of Kiev and then bringing in a bunch of airborne troops to assault the city and capture the president. But they failed, and their plan fell apart. They didn't have an alternate plan. They didn't, plan for what if it went wrong. Now they are struggling to get support away from Ukraine because otherwise they will lose. And Russia will suffer. It still suffers from World War II. It's going to suffer more unless they stop. Ukrainians would rather sing and dance, but they got these morons attacking them. I personally think the Ukrainians are doing fairly well. Many of us think they should be moving faster, but keep in mind, they know where the Russians are if they don't push through them and can bomb them and reduce their army, which is the actual goal. If you do that, you eventually get the territory. If things move too fast, you lose track of where they are and can't do much to them. Riding forward without ridding your opponent's military means you have a bunch of land and an army along your supply routes to deal with. Well, you are far from home, kind of like Vlad the Murderer has right now. So, is this Ukraine offensive really going slow? Or is that a lot of people bummed out because their imagination isn't what is happening in reality? I think it's the latter. Don't think it a failure because that hasn't been a mad rush. Things are going well militarily, though from a human perspective, unfortunately, people are being killed for no really good reason.